Hello, class. My name is Stephen Wright, and I will be giving my final presentation on the communication accommodation theory. This theory spurred from Mr. Howard Giles in the 1970s, and essentially, this theory goes on to talk about how we can interact with different people or different groups effectively through accommodating their communication practices and really just having a firm grasp on how we communicate and how they communicate and the things that we can do for each other to help one another understand each other's communication practices. So the communication accommodation theory is essentially done to help, like I said, people communicate effectively, different people from different cultures, backgrounds, different ages. There's so many different things that could go into what makes them different from one another and how they communicate. So what we're going to focus in on is how the communication accommodation theory helps to close or decrease a term referred to as social distance. So throughout this theory, we can understand that this is done through either convergence or divergence. In convergence, it's where you converge, you come together in an attempt to communicate better, and you try to essentially mimic one another. Through divergence is pretty much where you're forcing somebody or forcing that group to not necessarily accommodate you, but you're kind of forcing your way on them, if that makes any sense. It's the more harsh of the two between converging and diverging, but sometimes it's necessary, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. But through convergence, we try to adapt our communication skills to the other group or the other individual's communication skills and how they communicate. We try to mimic what they do because we're trying to seek acceptance. We're trying to fit in. Divergence is really where we, I guess, increase or amplify our differences and try to force them to come to our communication behavioral set. So the background on this story is I had a friend from Mexico when I was growing up. I was extremely close with their family, and I learned quite a bit about their culture, which has some differences from my culture, but overall it wasn't too far different. I mean, we're all from North America. We essentially have collectivistically the same communication type skills. So this isn't an extremely detailed, difficult case study per se when it comes to regarding my personal experiences. We had essentially the same type of religious views, even though on Christianity they differed in some aspects, but overall we had the same general consensus. His family, one of the differences between our groups was that his family essentially expected him to do well, as to where my family tried to help me do well. So there was a cultural difference in expectations on individuals. In the Mexican culture, you were, in my opinion, and from what I learned, my views on it was that they kind of expected you to have this role of being better, doing better on your own. They were real big on family, and they would do anything and everything for family, but they expected you to establish yourself. As to where me growing up and a lot of my friends growing up, our families helped us get to where we were. It takes a village to raise a warrior. I guess that's a saying that maybe we heard once or twice in our lives. But so yeah, there's a fairly well established difference in cultural expectations on an individual. One of the differences between the cultures involved eating. So in his household, when people would go to eat, everybody had to line up to get their food, and essentially the older people went first and the younger people went last. In my house, anybody could line up and go get their plate whenever they felt necessary, whenever it was time to eat, so on and so forth. Um, Also, some of the differences in the culture were revolved around cleaning. And this is where some things could get viewed as maybe disrespectful, and where we have to understand that just because one culture does something one way and another culture doesn't do something that way, it doesn't mean it's a sign of disrespect. It's just maybe it's their sign of respect, and we need to be open minded to that. So, for example, my mother was sick. His mother came over with some cleaning supplies and decided that they were gonna, clean the house. And my mother kind of took offense to it. It wasn't anything that was made publicly known. But in our culture, it's not like, somebody coming over and saying, "Hey, I want to help you clean your house." Like, that's mildly offensive. But in their culture, they always wanted to help their neighbor and or their friends, their family, and they were really, really big on having a clean house. Just cleanliness was a really big thing for them. So when my mother was ill and they came over to help clean, my mother thought, well, they think we're living like pigs here, when in all reality, that's not what it was going through their mind at all. They're just really big on cleanliness and helping. So all they wanted to do was come and help. They didn't think that we were living in a pigsty or anything like that. They just wanted to show their reverence towards us, and maybe that was communicated differently because of those cultural barriers. But it was something that helped us, that we should appreciate. It just kind of came off different because it's not a cultural norm in America, from what I've seen in my life, to just randomly go over to somebody's house when they're sick and just clean for them without being asked. So in their culture, helping is not necessarily always offensive, and in American culture, we tend to be prideful. So sometimes it's realizing your own values and beliefs and trying to overcome those cultural barriers to effectively communicate, because that could have resulted in some hostility, which fortunately it didn't. However, we just need to be cognizant that different cultures show their appreciation, their care for others in different manners than maybe we as Americans do. Other different communication patterns between cultures, I guess you could say, we'll talk about eye contact. Here in America, eye contact is a really big thing. It symbolizes understanding. It symbolizes respect for the speaker. It shows active communication or active listening styles. So it's pretty big here in the United States, in our culture. In Mexican culture, sometimes too much eye contact can be viewed as offensive. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about, because even here in America, if you just stare at somebody, that can be taken as offensive. Like, what are you looking at? But when we're talking in regards to communicating, like I'm talking to you through this video thing, or if we're in a classroom setting or in an office or somebody who's giving a speech, eye contact is a pretty big thing. It shows that you're actively engaged, not to be confused with just randomly staring and making somebody feel uncomfortable. Whereas through my experience in the Hispanic culture, Mexican culture, too much, like I said, too much eye contact can at times be viewed as offensive. So my recommendations essentially is we need to stay engaged with one another and remain open to each other. Divergence can feel threatening at times, but sometimes it's necessary. In both parties, we tend to converge to facilitate communication, And as a result of that, mutual appreciation at times tends to be the end result, which is what we all want. Um, we should approach intercultural interactions with a we-centered focus, and really hone in on those similarities and mutual concerns. Definitely, we don't need to jump to conclusions. We should always keep an open mind, and just trying to understand from a satellite view, not just a boots on ground view, um, that what we perceive to be bad or negative may not always be the case if we just open ourselves up to understanding that we're both trying to effectively communicate. In conclusion, essentially, we really need to make changes in our behavior as to how we accommodate other cultures or other individuals in order to decrease that social distance. We should definitely make an attempt to communicate clearly and recognize that not everything is offensive. Like I said, everybody has their different communication styles. So just be open minded to that. And so that way we can all peacefully decrease that social distance and have a better understanding of each other. Thank you and have a nice day.